I'm Alan.
And I'm Katie. And we're married.
Well, excuse me. That sounded like you were...
It was a matter-of-fact statement. We're married.
We're married. Deal with it. That's right. I don't know. How you doing today, Katie? It's been a good day? Been a good day today?
It's been good. I've been super emotional, but...
Oh, schmoopy.
We'll get into that another time.
Not now? All right.
No, not now.
Let's bring it to lighter topics like word of wisdom and getting into heaven. How's that?
Before we talk about that,
sure.
We wanted to mention that our workshop on a tightrope, our pre-registration closes Thursday, June 11th, and then it'll be regular registration. The bonus in signing up early is that you get $30 off. And you also get the bonus Flourish Masterclass, Powerful Ways to Grow in Sex and Intimacy. I'm so happy and delighted to know that half of our spots have been filled.
Yep. And
anyone else that wants to take advantage of that early, we would love to have you. Otherwise, we will open up to a regular registration after the deadline hits.
That's right. So if you'd like to join the pre-registration by June 11th, please go to Eventbrite and search for Workshop on a Tightrope. You'll find it there.
And also, this is a big news flash. You can use your HSA for this.
What?
I know.
How do they do it?
In fact...
This is actually new to me. I'm not
email us or message us. Someone asked if they could use their HSA card, and we did find out that because it is like a group therapy, we can run it through Symmetry Solutions, which is Natasha Helfer Parker's group, and you can use your HSA card. So if you have money on your HSA and you would like to use it for mental health and sign up for this course, you can do it. You just need to contact us and we can give you a way to do that.
Well,
so that's a big deal.
We have money on our HSA. Maybe we should sign up.
Maybe we should. All right, let's do it.
I think maybe we have a discount code for us.
That's right.
We're excited to get into this episode, episode 3 of 3 of the Word of Wisdom, and we have joining with us, who we will introduce here in a moment, James Ott. And Katie, this has already happened in our timeline. So how do you feel it went?
I felt like he was super intelligent, had a lot of really good things to say. He became very prepared. I want to warn our listeners, especially our ABMs, our active believing members, that this delves into a few history things. We don't get into any truth claims, just where the word of wisdom came from, and then a few stories, I guess you could say, of that in the early church years, and then when things shifted and changed. And then we talk about addiction.
Yeah, I think it's an important conversation to have, and I thought that James did a really good job with both aspects of that. He's an addiction specialist, so it's very helpful to have, and that's why we wanted to end with it, having someone that specializes in this field. So it was very helpful.
Yeah, I thought it was very helpful, and it was a pretty good open conversation that both Alan and I asked lots of questions for both the believing spouse as well as for those who are trying to negotiate how to navigate their feelings about wanting to try alcohol or whatever else it might be.
That's right. A lot of times it comes back to the alcohol conversation.
It does. I know. I think that's the most common, but there's a good reason why. And we talk about that with James, and he gives some very good information and advice.
And as we kick it over to the James Ott interview, I have to personally apologize to everybody listening, including Katie. I messed up on the audio. So I did not, on the Zoom meeting that we recorded with him, I did not have the correct microphone selected. So Katie and I sound a little bit distant in the recording. Please forgive us. And now let's turn it over to the interview with James. Now we are joined by James Ott, who we're really excited to have on the program. You know, when we talked about having a discussion on the Word of Wisdom, we knew that just the two of us, Katie, we weren't going to be able to do it alone.
No, we won't. No.
No.
So I actually asked Natasha Helfer Parker, who she suggested that we talk to help us with this episode, and she suggested James. And Alan, why don't you go ahead and talk him up a bit? Let's read his bio.
Let's do it. So James completed his Master of Social Work degree from New Mexico State University and has had his clinical licensure since 2000. He's a therapist he is a therapist at and the executive director of Red Willow Counseling and Recovery, an agency that provides outpatient mental health and addiction treatment. James has had a full-time private practice since 2010, providing individual and family therapy and also supervising other clinicians in his practice. He believes in a client-centered approach, identifying strengths to overcome places where a person can become stuck. He is proficient in cognitive behavioral therapy, motivational interviewing, EMDR, which I'm going to have to ask him what that means, and solution-focused therapy. His specialty is to work with treatment-resistant individuals and their families. James, thank you very much, and welcome to Marriage on Tightrope.
Thank you very much, Alan and Katie, for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
All right, so what's EMDR mean?
Oh, okay. Well, EMDR is eye movement desensitivity reprocessing. So it's a specialty training where I work with people who have trauma, and in this work, part of the work is we actually use a finger or a light and kind of wave it in front of the client's face back and forth so that the eyes shift from the left to the right, to the left to the right hemispheres. And somehow, we don't really know why, but that shifting between the hemispheres as you're cognitively processing trauma gives great healing. And it's clinically documented through a lot of research that this actually works well, but it's like voodoo.
Yeah. Wow. That's pretty cool. Now, I'm not sure if EMDR, what's of the specialties of which you specialize, to be repetitive, what do you feel applies most here in a discussion about the word of wisdom?
Well, I think that my experience with people and families with addiction is really what we're talking about. And when we talk about addiction, there's a lot of different addictions out there. I work with a lot of them, but I really focus more on substance addiction, drugs and substances, alcohol.
Food.
And not so much food so much, but that is a substance.
Sure.
Awesome. I feel like I have so many questions, but we did come up with an outline. So we'll just follow the outline so we don't jump all around.
Yeah. And, one thing I would love to understand, as much as you want to share, is kind of your familiarity. You're based here in Salt Lake City, so you're familiar with the LDS culture, but just what is your kind of background with either LDS clients or working within a LDS kind of theological
framework?
Framework.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in Utah. I'm well immersed in the I almost said Mormon. My goodness, that would have been bad. So I'm well versed in the LDS culture. I was, a member myself at one point, and so I speak the language. I understand the culture, I think, very, very well. And then with my background with addiction, and especially because of this background and specialty, I've done a fair amount of research into how substances has impacted the LDS culture, as well as the history and the mythology associated with all this.
So speaking of,
I think that's where we want to
I think that's where we want to hit on first is a little bit about the history. So for those viewers or listeners that are listening right now, as you know, we don't really go into a lot of history on the podcast. That's really that's not the point that we usually try to hammer in. However, I do feel like for this episode, it would be important to talk a little bit about a brief discussion of the history on the word of wisdom to help us understand and give us a framework from where we go from there, especially with James's specialties. So James, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and this in and of itself could be an hour-long podcast, right?
Yeah. Sure.
So, cut me off. I'll try to hit some key highlights, but I don't want to, in a sense, try to sway anyone's opinion or make any statements or anything. Really what I want to do is just outlay some of the facts that are known and let listeners make that discovery. For me, the more I've looked at the history and understood, the history and the facts of the word of wisdom, it has made the word of wisdom a lot more gray and less defined. We tend to think in the Mormon culture as like, here's the word of wisdom, and it's very black and white, but it wasn't always this way. So we know that the word of wisdom comes from section 89 of the Doctrine and Covenants, and this was given to Joseph Smith in 1833. And the piece here that I think is interesting is, number one, it was originally given as, what's the verbiage, is not by commandment or constraint, but rather for a principle and a promise. And over the years, it's held more and more authority, but originally it was really just almost a suggestion, like, hey, if you do this, then you're going to get these benefits. Yeah. Now, the other thing that's interesting about the word of wisdom, it's kind of a hot topic, but since 1833, there has never been any official church policy, declaration, revelation, anything since 1833, since the original. A lot of the ways we practice the word of wisdom now has just developed, and in a sense is cultural adaptations to the 1833 policy. Or I should say the 1833 revelation.
Right.
And I think that that's important for us to note because, for example, let's take the history of eating meat. In the Revelation, it says, meat is to be used sparingly in times of famine and winter. And in fact, it pleases God when we only use it sparingly or in times of famine and winter. And over the years, eating meat has kind of come and gone. Brigham Young was a very adamant proponent of very low meat consumption. And a lot of the prophets, through Lorenzo Snow and through Heber J. Grant, even there's a history of an apostle, George Teasdale. Again, this was like in the late 1800s, early 1900s. That this apostle believed that eating pork was worse than drinking coffee and tea. So we have this adaptation or this following of meat eating in the early days of the church, and now look at where we are today. We're a state that consumes large amounts of meat per capita. So that's a really good illustration of how this revelation has kind of adapted and twisted and turned, and people kind of come up with their own interpretations of it.
Right. And that, like you said, it's important to kind of understand the facts of that. Obviously, everyone listening here knows where my stance is on the truth claims of the church, but this is not a truth claim conversation.
No.
This is just how it's been practiced, how it's been adhered to and lived over the course of the history of the church.
Yes, very much so. And we can dive also into, the other parts of the word of wisdom, the strong drinks. And strong drinks interpreted is more liquor, whiskey, stronger spirits. And most of the prophets actually have had a pretty firm stance about not using strong drinks, although one prophet, I believe it was George Albert Smith, used to drink brandy, for medicinal purposes, and there's other noted apostles that have used liquor before in moderation. The word of wisdom also talks about that herbs, fruits, grains, and mild drinks made with barley are actually good for man. And what's a mild drink made with barley? That's beer.
Yeah.
Right? And so historically speaking, many, church leaders, Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, Lorenzo Snow, these church leaders and, other apostles, they didn't believe beer was a big issue. It really started to be an issue when in 1920s when the Prohibition came around. And then after Prohibition was repealed, the church started taking a firm stance on the use of alcohol, including beer.
It was right around that time that the word of wisdom was added to the temple recommending questions, correct? Do you have that in front of you? Do you know?
Yeah, it was actually added in 1902, but it really wasn't enforced until 1921.
Gotcha. And
really, until there's a reference to around even 1950 that the church administration was like, just don't let people that are drunk into the temple. And, they kind of, it was almost grandfathered in. The younger generation was held to a higher standard than the older generation. And, so in the 1950s, it started to be really, really strongly enforced.
Right. Anything on the... Yeah, keep going as far as any of the other historical points you wanted to bring up.
Yeah, I mean, kind of the meat and the alcohol are kind of the stronger historical points of the word of wisdom. And again, I think that this just kind of has evolved over time and in a sense become more and more adhered to, more and more strict. But there's a lot of speculation nowadays. There's a lot of we shouldn't drink Coke and we shouldn't, participate in certain other substances. And again, really, this is just speculation. There is no official church viewpoint on these subjects. So I think we got to be really careful about what is official and what is not.
Right.
Yeah, and I think the list can be very wide. Because and long because we could get into prescription drugs versus
we'll get there.
Yeah, we can get into prescription drugs, we can get into monsters, we can get into sugar, there's just so many things on that list, and so I feel like sometimes the thinking about all of it is a little bit daunting because there's a lot of language that we just don't have any direction for. Right.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, hot drinks is one that we haven't quite brought up yet. What do you think about that term, hot drinks? How was that interpreted originally?
Well, both Hiram Smith and Joseph Smith did afterwards say that hot drinks referred to coffee and tea. So again, while that's not in a sense, it's not an official revelation. They didn't say, "Thus saith the Lord" or whatever, but they implied this is what the Lord meant during this time.
Mm-hmm. I've seen some quotes that lump like a hot cocoa in there from the early days as well. Is that something that you've seen, or am I?
I haven't seen that, and I mean, the research I've done, there's a lot of these apostles that have made little teeny statements that, and some of them can be, again, George Teasdale, pork is worse than coffee and tea. Was it prophetic or was it his opinion?
Right.
Yeah.
So how did correlation play a part of this? Because now you get into the early 1970s and you have fewer instances of rogue apostles kind of proclaiming their own agenda, or not, agenda is not the right word, opinion or their own thoughts on it. But did correlation have any bearing on the word of wisdom in your mind or knowledge?
I think the biggest impact to the word of wisdom was prohibition. And again, over time since the 1920s, the 1950s, there's just been a stronger emphasis, more and more adherence to these principles, except the meat one. The meat's kind of fallen by the wayside for some reason. And, and then we start to get into a lot more speculation with, Coca-Cola and, processed foods that, I was thinking another one was John Widstow, and he actually said refined flour is actually against the word of wisdom. It's not a pure grain. It's been refined and the goodness was taken out. So here's again another, personal belief.
Well, and I mean, to be fair to Brother Widsoe, refined flour is pretty awful for you.
Yeah.
Oh, those awesome carbs that we all love.
Yes, not a lot of nutrition, but again, was he being prophetic, and why aren't we following it, or why do some people follow the Coke ban or the Mountain Dew ban? I'll drink Coke, but not Mountain Dew because it has 20 more, milligrams of caffeine or whatever it is. So,
right.
Exactly.
Yeah. So when we talk about this subject, I would call this a tender for a lot of couples. This is a really hard thing to talk about because there's a lot of preconceived notions about if you go, if you take one sip, then you're going down that bad path. I don't drink because I've got an alcoholic family. I don't, or you shouldn't, it's a slippery slope. That's another term that we hear quite often. So it can be really hard for couples to navigate some of these hard tenders because they have these preconceived notions. So let's talk a little bit about that. What do you say to someone who comes into this having those preconceived notions, and what have you heard?
I think that this is a very difficult issue. Because there is such a hard line, there is a lot of fears associated with this. There's a lot of preconceived notions and mythologies about that. The one drink mythology, my cousin's best friend's neighbor had one beer and they became an alcoholic.
It's like the mom who has a story for every bad thing that could happen. They have an example for it, right?
Yes. So we really need to, kind of go back to the facts and what the research shows. What we know is that addiction, substance addiction, is both, genetic and environmental. And we're looking at about 50-50. Some studies say 60-40 or 40-60, but, 50-50. And sometimes it's, it can be highly genetic and sometimes it can be highly biological. But that's where addiction comes from, is both the genetic and the environmental. Did I say genetic and biological? I meant genetic and environmental. The biology and the living environment, what you were growing up with. So with this comes like those ideas of just one drink. Also with our culture, we see drinking and smoking and using drugs as a moral issue. Like, these are bad people because they smoke cigarettes. These are bad people because they're drinking. And we really need to take the morality out of that. Now, do people with addiction make some bad choices, and in a sense some choices they wouldn't normally make if they were sober, or choices that contradict the moral value? Absolutely. But that also occurs in a lot of different situations. I mean, people commit murder for love. Should we say love is bad because I can get into a jealous rage and commit a murder? We were pretty not in a sense accepting, but we don't demonize and demoralize people that are in love. So we need to not look at this as a moral issue. Another thing that I see a lot in our society is, and you named it, Katie, is the prescription drug abuse that we have here in Utah. And time again, a familiar story is a person that never would touch a drop of alcohol or coffee or anything, but is either abusing prescription drugs, and these are mood-altering prescription drugs, most of the time anti-anxiety. This would be, Xanax and Ativan and Klonopin and sleep-enhancing, Ambien, Lunesta. Is either they're abusing those or they're just using it as prescribed, but they have been working, and while they may be working with a doctor and using them as prescribed, they are prescribed to intoxicating levels. They're prescribed to levels that, you or me, if we took it, would be, in high risk and high danger. So part of that problem, and that kind of goes back to a larger issue, is how very untrained many doctors are with addiction. And we're seeing a lot of that with the opioid epidemic that we've seen recently. And they're, historically, doctors receive 2 weeks of addiction schooling, addiction medicine schooling in their 4 years of med school. So for 2 weeks, they get a little brief rundown of, here's some addictive substances and this is what you do, but it's very glossed over. And so, not to these doctors' faults, they just have not been equipped to prudent prescribing ways. And now that's getting better. Doctors are becoming more and more informed, but it's still pretty rampant that people are using high levels of prescription medication that alter their mood, and whether they're using it as prescribed or abusing it. So that's another issue here in our community.
I think as LDS people, okay, we'll talk about me. For me, who's someone who was a rule follower to the T, I like to know exactly what I can and can't do. Okay, that's just my personality. So the fact that prescription drugs isn't on a list of things that I shouldn't be doing, I think, I can take those without a problem. I think that a lot of church members, I don't want to say get away with, but I think that they try to rationalize their approach of not, drinking alcohol, but drinking ungodly amounts of Monsters a day, because it's not a word of wisdom. It's not on the list.
Yeah.
And I think that that's the wrong thinking. Obviously, I've come to realize that that, like you said, you take the morality out of it, and we look at maybe like a bigger picture. Is this going to help me? Whatever I'm doing, is this going to make me healthier, happier, whatever you're using it for?
Yes. And who doesn't want a rule book to get into heaven? If I've got the checklist, and if I follow this checklist, then I'm in the celestial kingdom right there,
For sure. Yeah.
But, one of my, in my research, one of my favorite stories here is Joseph Smith given a, Bible pounding, hellfire and damnation thumping sermon on the word of wisdom, and then getting in his wagon and lighting up a cigar and driving up and down the streets of Nauvoo. And people wonder, why would he do that? Why would he openly, contradict himself? And I believe the message he was giving here is that he was trying to tell people, like, hey people, here's the information. You need to figure this out. Don't just follow me. Don't follow me to get into heaven. You need to figure this out and have that connection with God and know what's right or wrong. Mm. And that correlates to his famous statement about, we teach the people correct principles and let them govern themselves. And, going back further, what was Jesus's plan was free agency, and what was Satan's plan was, I'm going to tell you all the rules you have to follow and make you follow them.
Sure.
And so I think human nature, we want to be told what to do and what's if this is right, this is wrong, this is what we do for this result. And in reality, true concepts of spirituality is about having the connection with God and knowing what we need to do for our own selves.
So I hear what you're saying, and I think all this is great, and I love that idea of like, you choose for yourself, you decide for yourself what is best for you. And then I look at the current state of today. That doesn't really fly when you're going in to get a temple recommend to see your daughter get married, right? I mean, the question of do you obey the word of wisdom? I don't know if that's the exact way that it's stated. In theory, you should be able to just say yes or no, but in reality, a lot of times that's not where the questioning stops. I don't know if I'm eliciting or soliciting for you to respond to that. I just think it gets into this messy area where it does feel pretty legalistic today.
Yeah. But really, that question, do you obey the word of wisdom? That doesn't say, do you drink coffee? Do you smoke? Do you use monster drinks? It says, do you obey the word of wisdom? It implores us to study the word of wisdom, to pray about it, to receive guidance on what that word of wisdom means for us. And then we get to decide, whether or not we're obeying it. And, case in point, like, gosh, I eat a lot of meat. I guess I don't obey the word of wisdom. Or you know what? I have a beer a couple of days a week, but I'm eating a drink made with barley, and I guess I do. Now, I'm not in any ways trying to advocate slippery, sliding around the word of wisdom here. The point I'm trying to make here is it's our spiritual responsibility to ponder and wrestle with this and receive guidance through prayer. And then we make those decisions, and then we can tell the bishop or the stake president, yes, I do obey the word of wisdom, or no, upon reflection, I don't. And many of the temple questions are listed that way. It's up to us.
Right.
I actually really like that. I hadn't thought of it that way. I think the other challenge that I see or feel at church is going back to Joseph Smith, thinking about, the famous story when he was with the doctor and they were cutting out of his leg and he wouldn't drink the alcohol.
Yes.
Like, that story is the one that's held up as, this is the example. If he can do it, so can you, right?
Yeah.
In the sense of drinking, but also none of us, like, I as a woman don't reject an epidural when I have a baby.
Yeah.
Right? And is that in sense similar to that? And so, yeah, it's hard when you hear some of these stories come across, because I feel like there's just so much gray in there.
Well, again, here's the mythology, because while we tell that story, we don't tell the story of documented sightings of Joseph Smith on the streets of Nauvoo drunk. We don't tell the story of Joseph Smith who ran a tavern and that the brethren actually admonished him for selling whiskey, as part of his hotel and bar. And, they're like, hey, Brother Joseph, like, maybe you shouldn't be doing this. So, like, yes, I do believe that story is true. He did, deny the brandy or whatever it was for the operation, but he was not a teetotaler.
Right. Right.
And I think that's what it's important for people to understand here, is that we're trying to give you another perspective of the word of wisdom when we're going to talk about this.
And I think the next section that we wanted to get into is kind of the severities of following the word of wisdom and the benefits thereof. So, starting with, you were reading in D&C 89, or even thinking about how it's commonly practiced today, that's more relevant to today. What are the benefits of living that type of lifestyle? What are the benefits of following the word of wisdom?
Yeah. Well, let's start with D&C 89 here. If you follow the word of wisdom, you're going to receive health in your navel. Well, I'll read it. They shall receive health in their navel and marrow to their bones, and shall find wisdom and great treasures of knowledge, even hidden treasures, and shall run and not be weary, and shall walk and not faint. And then here's all these health benefits, and then you get the big one here. I, the Lord, give unto them a promise that the destroying angel shall pass them by as the children of Israel and not slay them. I mean, that's a pretty awesome promise, you know? So there's, in a sense, these promised blessings by adhering the word of wisdom. And then there's lots of documented benefits. And there's so many of these, that people who abstain from these substances also meat and sugar, though, by the way. Lots of health benefits. But there's also benefits of people who use these substances in moderation. We've heard the famous study of a glass of red wine every day, and there's a lot of health benefits there, cholesterol levels and that. Even there's some, I was reading a study the other day about daily use of coffee actually can be helpful, again, in moderation, a cup of coffee a day. I think it was helpful to various hormones and things like that. So I think the point here, though, is when we use these substances in excess. So number one, what's your spiritual belief on this? And what do you want to follow spiritually? And number two, what's your health belief on this? And there is a lot of benefit that can be used for some moderation in use. That doesn't include cocaine in moderation, by the way. This is very specific substances. But we do know that excessive use of these substances can be very damaging to our health. But again, excessive use to a lot of things, to, flour and sugar and milk products and other things can be very, very unhealthy for us.
What about, and we've touched on one of the recent episodes, but what about your understanding of medical marijuana, or not even medical marijuana, but recreational marijuana, and then even down into, psilocybin and some of those psychedelics? You mentioned cocaine. I mean, that's a pretty easy example of us to say, there's not a moderate amount of cocaine you should be consuming, or heroin, or meth.
Yeah. Yes.
But from a clinician, and again, I think it's important for our listeners to understand, we're not trying to get to this place where we're justifying the use of this or that. It's really trying to lean on some expertise within the clinical field of what these substances mean. So what about those?
Yeah. So there's a big movement here over the use of psychedelics. Low-dose ketamine has been shown to have very good effect for people with treatment-resistant depression. Marijuana, whether that's THC or the CBD or both, has been shown to have good effect for chronic pain issues or some other issues. Now, my belief here, and I want to specify again, this is my belief, we are all physiologically a little different. I might be able to tolerate sugar in different levels than you. In the same sense, you might be able to tolerate alcohol or THC or psilocybin in different levels than me. There's some people that can party like a rock star and use all sorts of substances in crazy amounts and, with very little deleterious effects. And other people, again, they use substances in a marginal manner and they get addicted. So I want to put out there this notion of subtle physiological differences, and that our body metabolizes substances differently, and that should be noted. Now, is there some health benefits to these kind of substances on the edge? Again, THC and CBD and psilocybin and ketamine, and yes, absolutely. And yes, I strongly agree that people can take these and use them as excuses to use them, excessively. And maybe what we might want to do is dip into kind of the idea of what is addiction.
Yeah, that's a great next place to go.
Yeah, I mean, because, here we go, like, I'm using such an XYZ substance, and is it a problem? Is it not? Because there is this idea that unless we're sleeping under the viaduct, we can be using substances. And there's a lot of CEOs or, professionals who competently perform their jobs who have a substance abuse issue.
So, okay, let me ask a question. Like, what is that line? When does it become an addiction? Like, is there a
criteria that you go through to identify something like that?
So this is not a light switch. This is not off or on. I would like people to think about addiction as a progressive disease. So we go from abstinence to experimentation to recreational use to use, misuse, abuse, and dependence. So we look at this as more of a spectrum, again, a progression. And again, this is going to vary according to our physiology. 18 beers to me might look a whole lot different than 18 beers to you. So there's that spectrum. Now, there is some definitions. The American Society of Addiction Medicine has this super long, 2-3 page paragraph on what addiction is. There's the diagnostic and statistical manual that we use as our Bible for diagnosing people. There's all these criteria on when does a person have an addiction or an alcohol problem. But one of my favorites is a statement by John Bradshaw, and he says addiction is a pathological relationship to any mood-altering experience that has life-damaging consequences. So again, a pathological relationship to any mood-altering experience that can be substances, it can be food, it can be sex and relationships and money and gambling, and any mood-altering experience that has life-damaging consequences. So when we look at our use of any, again, mood-altering experience, does it meet this criteria? Are we pathologically related to it? Is it damaging our life? And, from this, there's also some typical, there's some lists out there of physical and emotional symptoms of addiction. And would that be helpful to dip into at this time?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
So, physical symptoms of addiction are, people has physical changes. They look disheveled. They have poor hygiene. They look unhealthy, significant weight loss or gain. They're missing school or work. They're isolating. They're no longer involved in activities that they used to do. Money disappears a lot. There's risk-taking behavior. There seems to be, this life of chaos, basically. Life becomes more and more unmanageable. People are unable to manage stress as they used to. There can be sudden or extreme mood swings. People can be lethargic. People stop having daily structure. Depression, anxiety, shame, worthlessness, dishonesty. So the difficult thing about addiction is it can, again, it's progressive and it can be subtle and it can be hidden. And so, and there tends to always be some plausible excuse about why this is happening, what's going on, what happened to this money, and what happened to this, and why are you acting this way? And well, let me explain. And those are, because addiction is so shame-based, a lot of spouses they don't detect that there's a problem. They just think that there's just something kind of off. There's just something not right here. So that's what I see in a lot of the addiction work I do with couples and families.
So looking at this as it relates to the word of wisdom, I can just see, a believing spouse that really that's the wrong way of saying it, that really believes in the divine source of the word of wisdom. Here's what you're saying about addiction. All of those negative things that you just mentioned of, the symptoms of addiction and other personality traits. And I just think so many say, why in the world would you even want to tempt? It was just, why would you move on that scale at all away from abstinence? Why would you ever try that beer knowing that it could lead to a significant addiction and you could kill somebody in a car? And if you never drink it, you're never going to have that problem. What would you respond in that regard? I mean, I know that there's listeners out there thinking that. I'm just like, look at all of the negatives. Why in the world would you why would you want to do this?
I think I can answer that.
You can answer that?
Yes, go for it.
I think that, Alan, you don't necessarily hold that spiritual feeling. You don't feel like it's divine or that wisdom is right for you anymore, even though I still hold that for me. So I think that some of the fear is taken out of it for you and you're curious.
Maybe spiritually, but I hear what James just said, right?
Yeah.
And look, I'm obviously not voicing what I actually feel because I drink a cup of coffee every day. I'm not drinking alcohol at the moment because of this challenge I'm doing. But anyway, but I do know it's like, okay, take all the spiritual stuff out of it. We're talking to a clinician here that is saying, look at all of these things that can happen with addiction. So why in the world, non-believing spouse, take away I don't care about the spirituality. Why would, I think this for me highlights a lot of the fears that a spouse that still believes can have. They're not going to be the ones toying with this addiction scale.
So, but on a smaller scale, you could say the same thing about sugar. I mean, we go to Swig constantly and get a cookie and a drink every other day. On a very small scale, why wouldn't we stop that if we knew it was bad and it was causing us to gain weight?
You're onto something. I like that.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts, James?
I think there's many behaviors that have inherent risks, and that, in the LDS community, we see addiction as we see substance use as like, why would you ever risk that? But yeah, in that same vein, eating sugar, driving a car is risky, or people that go running. I can't run anymore because my knees hurt. It damages my knees. Well, why did I run all those years when it was damaging my knees? Because I enjoyed it. And this is the other thing about the use is this is not like sticking your hand in a fire or hitting your thumb with a hammer. Like, there's no benefits to doing that. Now, alcohol, there are benefits. It feels good. So you come home from a hard day of work and you have a beer, it feels good. There's the reward. And we haven't really gone into the brain chemistry of this, but our brain is designed to survive, and how it has kept us alive for millions of years is that it has pursued pleasure and avoided pain. And this, drinking a beer, pumps high levels of dopamine into your brain, and it feels good. It's rewarding. It's part of the reward system. It amplifies the reward system, and we tend to go back to things that feel good to us.
So, James, tell us, I'm thinking of a lot of couples that are in our situation right now, and they have, they may have a spouse who wants to dabble in it, right? I mean, coming from a Mormon background where nothing about drugs, alcohol, tobacco, other than to stay away from it, what would you say? What advice would you give to anyone who decides that they want to try? Because, I mean, we've heard great stories and we've heard bad stories. We have a couple friend that they decided that they were both out and they wanted to try drinking. They went and bought a ton of alcohol and for a weekend locked themselves in an Airbnb. And then after a couple drinks decided they hated it and spent the night throwing up. So could you talk a little bit about, how do you educate yourself on something you know nothing about?
Yeah. And that's great aversion therapy, by the way. So you drink large amounts of alcohol and then throw up, like you are not going to go back to that.
Yeah, it's like that kid that was caught smoking and his parents make him eat a pack of cigarettes.
Or smoke the whole pack, yes.
Smoke the whole thing, you get sick, never want to do it again.
Well, so and this is, again, part of the difficulty with our culture is, number one, we don't have any healthy role models. We don't have role models of somebody that, like, has a drink at the end of the evening, or there's a party and, a couple of beers are consumed and that's it. And number two, this is such a moral issue and guilt plays such a huge factor that it's like, well, if I'm going to drink, I'm going to drink. And I'm just not going to say, oh, I'm going to try one beer. It's like, oh, I feel so guilty. I'm going to have 5. And then your body isn't used to that level of alcohol and you have knowledge of what your use is. And so it ends up being a horrible experience. And so if people wanted to experiment, number one, I would stay with legal drugs, which basically means alcohol. I would have somebody with you, somebody that kind of just hang out, make sure you're doing okay, whether that person is a responsible drinker or stays sober. You just have someone with you and just try moderation. Just have one and see what that experiment is like. Now, as far as, other drug use, I really wouldn't recommend that. Especially, we can really go down a dark road there.
Yeah.
Stay with the legal stuff, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And thinking back to our experience, we did that, and we talked about it last episode, so we don't have to, but the first few experiences I had drinking, I was with Katie, and it was one drink, and it was, let's see what this is like. There's no need to dive into drinking 4, 5, 6 beers all at one time. Just kind of try it out. And look, we're not saying everyone listening should be trying this. It's if you've made the decision, if you've talked to your spouse, you guys have gotten to a place where the spouse that is transitioning or has changed has said, I've decided I'm going to try this. These are some of the tips to keep in mind. I just want to make it, we want to make it very clear. We're not saying this is something everyone should be trying.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right. Because I still find value in the word of wisdom. And so that's not something I'm gonna do for me. But the other question I had.
Let me interrupt real quick though, because I'm realizing that some of our listeners might be in states where marijuana is legal too.
Okay.
Right.
And so, I kind of think that the same rules apply, moderation, make sure you're safe and again, stay legal. I also think it's important to educate yourself. A lot of people talk about marijuana as like, it's safer than alcohol and these sorts of arguments. And you're right. Like, alcohol is by far the most dangerous drug out there. There's more people addicted to alcohol than any other substance. There are more people die from alcohol than any other substance. And we often forget this. Again, we're looking at the opioid epidemic and all this. Well, more people die from alcohol by far than opioids. So, in that same sense, marijuana is a safer drug, but we have hybridized marijuana to contain 5 to 10 times the amount of THC than what it was in the 70s. It's more natural form. So, this is like the Arnold Schwarzenegger marijuana now, as opposed to, a normal human being.
Richard Simmons marijuana.
Yes, Richard Simmons. Yes. And so with those high levels, we're seeing psychosis and mood disruption that we have never seen before. And also with marijuana that doesn't happen with alcohol is that when you use it, we talk about brain development, and your brain doesn't really fully form till you're, early to mid 20s. So marijuana has a dramatic impact on the brain information that decreases or stops executive functioning skills learning, and also even the structural, we call it the myelinization of the neurons. So like the insulation around the electrical cords of the brain, of each neuron of the brain, is stunted. And so it has profound developmental brain effects if used, in your teens or early 20s. So, do your research. See, where are you in life? How old are you? What kind of impact are these substances going to have on you on a short and long-term basis? That's the other warning I would give.
Really good information.
Yeah, that's really good. Okay, so this kind of goes along with that. I'm thinking about a lot of our listeners have kids, and one of our biggest issues is keeping things like alcohol in the house. That's a big hot topic, a hot button issue, I would say. Any type of substances. A lot of people on my side, the active believing side, really don't want any of those substances in the home. It's really to try to keep out of the hands of kids, if you have teenagers in the home, all of those things. So do you have any ideas as far as that goes? Whether that's positive, negative, if you would suggest, putting it in the locked cabinet, if they do want to have it, what would be your suggestion?
So, yeah, I think this is a negotiation for couples. And what we do know is the research shows that parents that are openly drunk in front of their kids, not so much drinking, but are openly drunk, parents that are permissive, encourage their children to drink, their teenager wants to have a party. Well, mom and dad, if I'm going to go to this party and I'm going to go drink, and so maybe you should have the party here if you want it to be safe. And so mom and dad feels blackmailed and like, let's have a party so I can watch over and make sure everybody's safe. Like those attitudes, it's an enabling attitude, and it's really unhealthy, and it's likely to increase the likelihood of the children having addiction later on in life. As far as whether or not alcohol in the home can cause any addiction, I actually don't know of any studies. There may or may not be, but I can't recall reading any studies about that, if it's good or bad. But really, it's a negotiation. And if one spouse is like, I really don't want it in the house, okay, well, then I'm not going to buy it. I won't bring it home, or I'll only buy it when we have a special occasion, or, whatever the negotiation is. I have a special fridge that's locked downstairs, whatever it is.
Yeah. And speaking to what you just said about kids growing up in where their parents are openly drunk, I think that a lot of listeners have had experiences where they have trauma from either family members, usually it's family members that were alcoholics themselves, or, siblings who maybe abused substances, and they bring that to the table in their marriage, and that's a really hard thing for them to get over if they have a spouse wanting to go down that road and try alcohol where they have trauma. So can you speak to someone, a family member, maybe a spouse that's dealing with their own trauma background, and how do you work through some of those?
So yes, having parents that openly use drugs or alcohol and openly intoxicated can be a very traumatizing experience. Especially those sorts of environments can involve, huge parties and the kids are just kind of off in the corner. But also, I mean, this just is common relationship therapy because our childhoods impact our relationships. So whether that was trauma over substances or sexual trauma, or whether that was religious trauma or other, hundreds of different factors, we all bring that into the relationship. And this is part of negotiation and understanding and compromising. So that, I mean, it's kind of a bigger issue in a sense, but it's basically like, okay, I bring this to the relationship, you bring that to the relationship, let's put it together and let's figure out what we need to do with it.
Yeah, and two, I mean, I'll just speak from experience, two people that enter the marriage feeling like they're on the same page, and then one has a faith transition and then decides that whatever was compromised for that they were on the same page about at the beginning gets changed. I think that's where the trauma can come up again, because they feel like, oh no, wait, hey, you're changing the contract here, and I'm not okay with that, right?
Yes, very much so. And there can be a large betrayal here.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And that's part of the difficulty in couples that deal with a faith transition is the betrayal. This isn't what I signed up for.
Yeah, and I mean, it goes back to what you're talking about, addiction, especially like the fear of telling someone, where you are. That can happen in marriage. We see a lot of couples that don't tell their spouse that they've gone out and they've already been drinking with friends because of the fear that they will get from the spouse, right? From that reaction.
Yeah, and this is also doubly so because addiction is really based in shame. And so a person who's using substances, and again, this is a spectrum, this is a progression. So maybe they're using it maybe a little bit excessively. Their spouse may not have any idea because number one, they're going to hide it because of the religion issue. And number two, they're going to hide it because of the addiction issue and they're shamed for it. So really, part of the secret here, and I think this applies to all aspects of relationships, is to provide a safe space in your relationship. This is, you can come to me and we can talk about whatever we need to talk about. I'm not going to overreact. I'm not going to judge you. I'm not going to respond because of my own fears and my anxieties. I want to create this safe space where we can talk things through. That's where we all want to be in our relationships.
I love that. That's probably a great place to, as we're here hitting the hour point, I want to make sure, James, before we cut you off, if you're looking at your notes or there's something burning a hole in your head and it's like, oh, I didn't talk about this. Like what else do you have?
I would finish off with that, the providing the safe space in the relationships. We aren't taught on how to approach these things. We're not taught how to approach difficult issues. I had some really good friends of mine. Well, I have some really good friends of mine, but they had an infant daughter at 6 months old, died. And he eventually went back to work. She stayed at home. But he said, he talked to me a little bit later about that experience. And he said, it was the weirdest thing. People would come in and they didn't know what to say. And they would just stand there, or they would just ignore things. They would just pretend nothing had happened, that I hadn't been gone for, I don't know, what was it, 2 or 4 weeks that he was gone from work, or he's like, people just respond awkwardly. And he's like, it just feels so alone and isolating because no one says anything. No one has approached this. And he said, I just wanted someone just to say, hey, I'm really sorry for your loss. Or someone to just say, I don't even know what to say here. I've never experienced this, but if you need something, I'm here to talk. And so I'm a huge believer, like, again, we're not taught how to approach these issues. So even just saying, hey, what can I do? Hey, I'm sorry. Or, hey, I really want to talk about this. Or, hey, I have a concern and I don't even know how to bring this up. Or I don't even know what to say. Like, this is part of that learning to have difficult conversations in our relationships. And relationships meaning our spouses, our significant others, or with friends or whoever. Just don't avoid the difficult conversations and just speak up.
Very good advice.
Very good advice. Gosh, James, if there is someone out there listening who would like to meet with you or talk to you or is interested in counseling, how can they find you?
Yeah, probably the easiest is just through my website. It's redwillowcounseling.com.
Awesome. Willow as in the Val Kilmer late 80s.
That's true.
Willow. Sure everybody knows Red Willow. Okay, University. Sorry, redwillowcounseling.com.
The redwillowcounseling.com.
Wonderful.
And we'll link to it in all of our show notes. James, thank you so much for being here. I have learned a lot and really grateful for your expertise and for your preparation for this interview.
You're very welcome. It was really good to be here. Thank you.